talking about design institutions, what they are, what their role is in society, the challenges they face, and the way they're changing to meet those challenges. I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished panel. To my immediate right here is Arturo Dell'Acqua Bellavitis, the president of the Triennale in Milan. To his right is Sir Christopher Frayling, the former rector of the Royal College of Art in London and the ex-chair of the Design Council. To his right is Radha Kapoor, who is founding ISDI, the Indian School of Design and Innovation, which launches this summer here in India. And to her right is Deyan Sudjic, the director of the Design Museum in London. We've really appreciated a couple of the more interactive discussions today, the ones where there was a conversation and interaction with you, the audience. And then we're going to have a conversation about design institutions, museums, schools, because this is a very rare opportunity to hear people like this talking amongst themselves in front of you about the way museums and schools are changing today. Shall we start with you, Arturo?
Yeah. Just a few words about the Triennale. If you come to Milan during the Furniture Fair, or you probably will come there, it's an institution, it's the oldest world institution linked to the World Exhibition dealing with architecture, design, fashion, and people like Alvar Aalto and Le Corbusier were unknown before coming in 1930 to the Triennale. The Triennale started in Monza, which is the building district, the furniture district north of Milan. Then in 1930 it moved to this building, which was offered to the city by a tycoon of a period. Unfortunately, today, the big tycoons, Armani and Dolce & Gabbana and so on, they are not offering anything to the city, unfortunately. You know, the building was very innovative for the period, and many pavilions and even quarters in the city, like similar to the Werkbund in Stuttgart, have been built just after the Second World War. In the gardens around the building, we have pieces of art like this fountain by De Chirico, and a few years ago, the Parliament decided that they wanted to open a design museum, and you know, the Parliament is not in Milan, it's in Rome, but they decided it could be in Milan. This is the coffee shop, which is quite interesting because in design museum you can't touch objects. At least in the coffee shop you can sit on chairs and use what usually is exposed in a quite unfriendly way. When we had this duty to open the design museum, we were wondering, do we need a design museum? Have we to show our collection? The Triennale is a huge collection. We thought most of design museums are boring. We don't want that, you know. Moreover, so many people are coming to, here you see some exhibition of the Triennale. They are coming to Milan during the Furniture Fair, you know. So we need a different kind of museum. So we did a big agreement with 90 factory museums all over the country that people don't go and visit. And because of this agreement, we can get all the items we want from their collection. And every year we change the museum. So we have a changing museum. Every year we have a new curator, a new exhibition designer. And what has been exhibited the previous year usually went to Tokyo or to Incheon, Seoul, because we used to have a venue there too. And all the exhibitions are modular, and we take them around. In this very moment, we have an exhibition in Bilbao, which will go to San Francisco and then to Santiago del Chile. And that's it's the idea behind our institution. Moreover, there are other elements in the slideshow of this exhibition. You have seen we always make experiments about exhibiting. For example, experiments about moving exhibition, an exhibition which every week is changing because there is a different curator. And of course, you need to have a very intelligent organization of the exhibition just to reach this kind of idea. We also have special programs for the children. We have a Triennale Kids program. In all the exhibition, we print novels, and parents can go with the children through the exhibition. Because our idea is that every year, the museum exhibition is a kind of small tile, and through them, little by little, we do build up the real history of Italian design. But a design museum has to have great connection for the future. For example, we think that we must work with companies, and so a real design museum must have a restoration area which must work. Let's speak about the restoration of lamps made in plastics in the 50s or the 60s. How to restore them when the color is fading, you know? So we work with chemical engineers of Politecnico, and here you see some images of the different exhibitions of the museum, and we want to be, in a way, like this room. It's the only piece of a museum which is still there every year, because it's a kind of hub, of place where we show books, we have lots of events, and the school is the place, the Triennale is the place to be, to, in a way, discuss about different subjects linked to design. Of course, we have the biggest university in the world because of the number of students, which is the only public design university, which is Politecnico, and with them we develop, as Triennale, lots of different programs. But we must wonder which is the next frontier. Polyhub, which is a hub for young generation to have new ideas and to develop. This is the building where we host them, close to the campus, where students can develop new projects and new small companies financed by the university. But we are a country where bureaucracy is even as tough as India, you know? So we want to build consortium with other universities in order to be much more flexible. So, for example, we have Milan Fashion Institute, which is a consortium with the most famous economical university in Italy, Bocconi, and the Catholic University for Sociology. But we also have another consortium with the oldest European Academy of Arts, Accademia di Brera, which was founded in the Renaissance, you know, and we have lots of people coming and going, relationship with universities around. Of course, in India, we have a relationship with the old institution, but there is also something future, you know. In August, we will open our courses with our partners in Gurgaon, and that is a new challenge. Why? Because in 2 years, all our postgraduate education and PhD will be only in English. And to forget your own national language, it's a problem. And, but we don't want to teach in English to Italians. We want to attract new, good brains from all over. In this very moment, we have an Indian exhibition in the Triennale, Indian New Design, and we do hope in the future, some of you, I have met them today, are exhibiting their items in our venue. We do hope in the future to, through this relationship, our courses with new brains, to have very good students from India exhibiting in Milan during the furniture fair, because we also wonder which is the meaning of Milan. The etymology of the world is land in the middle, so we are a big shop window for the world. Our Dutch friends were showing projects delivered in Milan, you know? So it could be a very good shop window for good Indian brains and new designers of the future. Thank you.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about why design museums or museums of design exist. And I'm starting with the world's first Museum of Design, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which was built partly with the profits of the Great Exhibition of 1851. And it was begun as an institution which was going to show British manufacturers how to make better products. It was going to be a museum of industrialization, of mass production of the next thing. And of course, immediately as it opened, became something entirely different. It became a museum of the decorative arts. Its attempts to persuade British manufacturers to do better things, one could say, ran into the sand. It became an exquisite museum of 4 million objects. There are so many objects in the collection that they can rarely all be seen, but it is that early model of design as a means of improving manufacturing, and one which was actually then abandoned. One could say then that the second model for a museum of design was the General Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, which was begun in New York in the 1920s and 1930s, in which design was allowed into the museum only if it was pretending to be something else, art. So one could see a Leger painting of ball bearings across the hall from some actual ball bearings, which were presented as if they were sculpture. So there was a description of the date, the artist's name, and the material, and that was about it. And I guess, as the director of the Design Museum in London, one thinks there might need to be another way to tell the story of what design is. I guess one could say that art in a museum speaks for itself, and design needs some sort of explanation, some sort of rationale for what it's doing there. And the model I always talk about to try to explore that idea is, if you're an art museum director, and you are fortunate enough to have access to Picasso's Guernica, and you show it, it would of course be interesting to know something about the German aircraft that bombed that Basque city during the Spanish Civil War. It will be fascinating perhaps to see the newspaper reports at the time, which caused so much international outrage that Picasso was moved to paint that remarkable work. And yet it would in some ways distract from its power as a work of art. It would actually be intruding between the audience and the artist. If, however, you happen to be a museum of aircraft technology, and you had one of the aircraft which bombed Guernica in your collection, then you need to know exactly what it did and how it did it. So if you actually had an aircraft museum and you had that bomber, it would be quite important perhaps to show an image of Guernica to put and give some sort of context. And I guess that's really the thinking about what you put design in a museum for. Thank you.
I'm not going to talk about the Royal College from the podium, but we'll be discussing it a little bit later. I want to talk just for a moment about a subject that's been largely absent from this gathering, and that is public policy in relation to design. But before you all fall asleep, I think it's a subject of great interest to all of us, which is extremely difficult to get right. We heard this morning about some of the challenges facing Indian design culture: lack of understanding of design, the icing on the cake rather than the cake itself. How to harness the cultural heritage of India, its regions, to the language of contemporary design. Act local, think global. Design as culture, design as engineering, design as business. Design with a big D, design with a little d. And we also learned that you have the most extensive craft sector in the world, with high manual skills, that you have a youthful demographic, 50% of your population under 25, that you have a diverse society that values self-expression, and a legendary ability to improvise, what J.K. Galbraith, the economist, called functioning creative anarchy, fast, flexible, and connected, all of which were touched on this morning. But the issue of public policy, what would the role of a government, whether it's a local government, a federal government, or a central government, be in stimulating those things and in trying to address them? I was chairman of the Design Council for 6 years, and I lived this problem. Matter of fact, someone sent a letter to Christopher Frayling, the Divine Council, and I got it, astonishingly, because everyone has such high expectations of design councils, they're almost of divine status. Two models. When the Design Council was founded in Britain, and I use the British example because I know it, in 1944 it was called the Council of Industrial Design, and it saw its function as promoting the design profession, that its role was to stimulate manufacturers through promoting the design profession. So the first thing it did was put on an exhibition at the V&A called Britain Can Make It, 1947, which is still the most successful exhibition the V&A have ever put on. It had over 1 million visitors. It was subtitled by the public, "But Britain Can't Have It," but that was another story. Design Magazine, 1949, promotion of designers. The Festival of Britain, 1951, and a design index, where they had a list of interesting designs, approved designs, which were highly publicised. The opening of a design centre in 1956, a showcase for designers in the Haymarket in London, and then a cafe and a shop, and competitions and tours and prizes and product endorsement. So phase one is the promotion of the design profession, a kind of trade association for designers. In the 1990s, the Design Council completely flipped and decided to do something utterly different. Instead of promoting designers, it saw its role as stimulating business to make more effective use of design. So it saw its role in three different areas. One, with business support, information, successful product stories, innovation stories, case studies which might inspire industry to make use of designers. Secondly, education, a lobbying organisation for the teaching of design in schools and in universities, and indeed school environments, improving the environment in which children learn in. And finally, government, setting up a parliamentary group of members of parliament with an interest in design and dealing with all sorts of departments of state. Design against crime with the Home Office, design and the environment with the Department of the Environment, design and health with the Department of Health. In fact, there was a debate in the House of Lords when I was chairman of the Design Council. 8 of their lordships took part. I wrote the speeches for every single one of them. The Design Council had this role where politics is concerned. So I think the question facing, one of the questions facing India, and I know nothing about the India Design Council, is which of those models is the model that will build bridges between the design community and business. It is incredibly difficult to do both at once. You're either a trade association for designers, fine, or you're a stimulus to business. It is very, very difficult to do both at once, particularly at a time of limited resources. I think that's a really interesting challenge. Thank you very much.
Radha, why don't you tell us in a few words a little bit about ISDI, which is coming this summer?
I think through today's discussions, it's a proven fact that there's an urgent and growing need for design in India. Especially design education, which can play a significant role in social improvement, in economic development, cultural preservation. Keeping that in mind, we're starting an initiative called the Indian School of Design and Innovation, which basically is a new model of education. We're looking at a new approach of design thinking, where we can really sort of reflect the Indian idiom of design, and also where it's really Indian in its constitution. So whereas we can embrace the West, but really integrate our culture and tradition and not really lose our cultural integrity. So that's really the idea behind the school.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll come back to that. So we have here representatives from 2 major European museums, former representative of one of the major design schools in the world, and representative of a forthcoming design school in India. And we'll come to the relationship between museums and education. But I'd like to start in Europe, where, as you know, we're deep in a culture now of governments slashing their public funding. And I'd like to ask Deyan, what are the key, and Arturo, you can join in this particular point, what are the key challenges facing the museum today?
One of the advantages of running a small private museum is that we don't depend too much on a government subsidy. About 10% of our annual costs are provided by the government, and that's shrinking. So we support ourselves by selling tickets, by running a museum shop, and I used to be a journalist, and in those days I always thought that museum shops were in fact the work of the devil. Now I know they are actually quite useful, and they are a way into the museum. And through sponsorship. And I guess that's really one of the key issues that are behind museums when they're looking at design, which is looking at the work usually of people who are involved in selling, in industry, and who tend to be alive. How can a museum look at the work of an Apple or an IBM or a Samsung in a museum context and ask questions about it? Because the point of a museum is not to be a shop window or a sales organization, but to really try to question and understand and analyze. How can you actually do that in a context in which you might need a sponsor? How can you actually do a retrospective about the work of Jonathan Ive without it looking like the Apple showroom in Regent Street? And I guess that is where the curatorial voice comes in, and rat-like cunning in trying to fund these things in that way. And it's a question which I thought about a lot. So if I were going to do a show about Apple, I probably wouldn't do it about Apple as such, but I might look at how Olivetti and IBM and Samsung and Apple have all been patrons, one could say in some ways, organizations that have actually changed the world with disruptive technologies, who've all presented themselves in extraordinarily and interesting ways through industrial design, through architecture. One could draw remarkable parallels between the studio that Apple operates from, which is a gated compound in Cupertino. The address is 1 Infinite Loop, which tells you an awful lot about the organization, where you have to sign the Official Secrets Act to get into the door. And compare that with Olivetti's model back in this heyday when it occupied a Renaissance palazzo in the Corso Venezia in Milan with Mario Bellini on one floor and Ettore Sottsass on the floor below. And they were both allowed to maintain parallel studios outside, apparently utopia for a designer. On the other hand, of course, Olivetti went down the tubes and Apple was briefly the most profitable company on the planet.
Arturo, why don't you briefly tell us about, I mean, obviously museums are relying, as Dan said, on sponsors more and more. Tell us about that relationship. When does a museum step over the line in their relationship with a sponsor?
Yeah, but I must also add something about how to survive, you know, because he was saying we are a private museum. I could say we are a state museum, but I guess what we get from our state is, which is 30% of our income, it's less than their 10, because it's nearly nothing. So there is another option, which is very interesting, is to work with other museums. In Europe, we had the Museum Conference, which was started with Vitra. We entered and we really work a lot with them, and we work with all the other design museums. So we exchange exhibitions, or we do produce together, because we know in advance which are the ideas, because we know 3 years in advance what everyone is planning. So we can share exhibition, or we can say, I will develop this project, you will develop the other one, and we will exchange. So we cut the costs. Then sponsorship is very important, but we are a museum, so we must always kind to choose the kind of sponsorship, you know. We are lucky because being in Milan, many European companies, mainly German companies, invest in developing new concepts, you know. All the Italian brands of the big European groups use the Italian brand to develop new crazy ideas, you know, and because of that, they like to be united to the design world, let's say, that is to say, even the design museum, so they don't ask much back, maybe to have a party in the museum with an opening evening by night, to exhibit maybe one car designed by a famous designer during the furniture fair, that's all. So we have a relationship with BMW, with banks, and that's the only way to survive. And then we are in Milan during the furniture fair. We host many private exhibitions, but there is a commission because we must choose the quality of what is going to be exhibited.
Sure. And where do you draw the line? In other words, when does a sponsor ask too much?
We say no.
No, but what do they ask when they're asking too much?
Oh, when they're asking too much, maybe they're proposing something which is too commercial, which can't be hosted in the institution, but they know from the very beginning that if they want to ask too much, they don't come to us. In Milan, there are lots of exhibition places. During the furniture fair, they go there. So there is natural selection, usually.
But of course, the more that you're ready to say no, the higher your value as well.
Of course. And the most we are, in a way, successful for what we do,
there was a famous example where Giorgio Armani had an exhibition of his work at the Guggenheim in New York. And there was a donation of, I believe, $12 million from the Armani Foundation to the Guggenheim, which was described by the New York Times as the Guggenheim selling its dignity at too low a price.
So we know that there's this more or less comfortable or uncomfortable relationship with the private sector. But if we take Britain for a moment, we know that the creative sector is worth almost as much to the economy as the financial services sector, and yet...
And employs twice as many people.
Exactly, and yet we also know that the government policy favours the financial sector in a tremendous way and does not particularly do much to support the creative sector, which is supposed to kind of look after its own interests. So, Christopher, with your experience of negotiating with politics, how do you get government to take an interest, or not just to show an interest, but to demonstratively prove an interest in that sector?
Well, firstly, the whole phrase, the creative industries, which was invented in the late 1990s to describe a sector of which design is a part, is very useful rhetorically. Actually, it doesn't exist. I mean, if you look at fashion, software, antiques, tourism, they've got nothing in common as industries. But if you bundle them together and call them the creative industries, it's very useful rhetorically. It looks like a sector of the economy that's been neglected and hasn't. So that worked for a time. It doesn't work anymore in Britain, by the way. If you want to see a Conservative politician wince, mention the phrase creative industries. Right? So that was one. The most successful thing I did at the Royal College was to do a survey of graduate destinations, where the students ended up 5 years after leaving and where they ended up 10 years after leaving. And we tabulated this, and okay, we're a conservative, a postgraduate, entirely postgraduate institution, and, you know, very high end. So in a way, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it ended up that 98% of the graduates ended up in work in the subject they'd studied at the college, which is the best statistic of any university in Britain. And that, you know, there were questions in the House of Commons about it. It worked a dream. And you have to constantly refresh that argument. You know, creative industries have gone, graduate destinations are getting a bit tired because everybody's doing it now, and a lot of it's fiction, by the way, but that's another story. And so you have to find some pragmatic argument. There is no use in arguing idealistically. Design is good for you, art is good for you, aesthetic. Politicians don't give a damn about that. What they want is pragmatic arguments about UK PLC. And if you can argue that your institution is in some way contributing, or Italia, you PLC, whatever it is, then for a season they'll believe you, and maybe it will do something about your grant. You've got to be very nimble on your feet in representing the arguments, maybe every 2 years.
We, partly because of, for the audience, partly because of government funding, or the cutting of government funding, the Royal College of Art, which you used to be the rector of, is having to change its model quite considerably, taking in many more students, many more foreign students who pay higher fees. Can you speak a little bit about that and what that's going to do to the education that they can provide? This is a world-class design school.
In England, there are certain institutions, a couple of dance academies, drama schools, music colleges, the RCA, and a couple of others, which are very small, very face-to-face, only 850 students at the Royal College when I left a couple of years ago. And for that reason, they're very expensive to run, because you've got no economies of scale. You've got no undergraduate sector to shift the costs onto. And also, there's a great premium on face-to-face teaching. Now, I've worked in the sector since 1972, and there is no better way of teaching art and design than face-to-face between two human beings, right? You can talk about distance learning, you can talk about Skype education till you're blue in the face. There is no substitute for an individual engaging with another individual and bringing them out, the meaning of education. So they're very expensive. I mean, it worries me that, you then cut the premium, which is what's happened at the Royal College, and indeed in the music colleges and everything else. So you then have to take extra students to balance the books. So you lose the face-to-face quality if you're not careful. One thing you retain, though, and I'm a great believer that some people see overseas students as a problem. I actually see it as a huge opportunity, because multiculturalism is one of the great secrets of why London is so successful in the design and youth culture world. Afro-Caribbean students, Indian students, Chinese students, African students, European students, British students, all mixing in a design studio and nourishing it from all these different directions, for me is a huge plus. Some people say, well, too many foreigners. I mean, for Christ's sake, in design, which is a global language, It seems to me impossible. So I'm not so worried about that, but I'm very worried about losing the face-to-face concentrated quality. That's how the Bauhaus succeeded. The Bauhaus had 125 students. Its staff-student ratio was to die for. It was a tiny, concentrated community of people who actually were residential. They slept there. So the whole place was like a monastery, you know, the way that it was run, and very intensive. And look what came out of that. That's the way to run an art school. So I am worried that it spreads itself too thin and you lose that synergy.
I could add something more, because I think London, of course, because there are people from all over the world speaking English, but if they want to be successful, they must produce their ideas. So if I think of a famous British designer, they must come where there are industries. That is Italy. They must come. So, yeah. And the great difference, in our schools, we were speaking Italian. Now we go, that's why we go to English, because we want to attract them. And there is a great difference, because I must say for many British universities, the foreigners are a business. For Italian, no. They pay like the Italians, that it depends on the family income, because it's a state service for Italians, but for the world. That is our idea. Maybe it's a utopic idea, but you can pay €0, even if you are an Indian, or if you come from Chile, or from Brazil, or from Italy. You know, it depends on your family income. The maximum is very, very low. It's €3,000, which is nothing. Of course, it's complicated to live there.
You won't actually see a professor, of course, but
of course, professor, I'm not paying
in the architecture course at Rome University.
No, that's why we have venues in China. We are opening here. You know, I think we have friends from Parsons, but they're graduated honoris causa. They are from Politecnico. Our PhD, of course, American University can pay them, so we lose. We have a brain drill to most of your countries, unfortunately. Maybe it's crazy not to make foreigners pay, or even Italian,
but I don't want to make this an issue
utopic.
I don't want to make this an issue of nationalism.
No,
I really don't. I mean, you know, we're in a global business, and the interchange between I mean, Dyson, for example, in England employs 28 of my graduates. So what price industry in Milan?
Well, let's not make it national, let's make it about models. So we've just seen...
No, moreover, we are the same country, because it's Europe.
No, but we've seen 2 models in Europe.
2 models.
Radha, you have the opportunity to start a new school from scratch in India. We're all looking to India and Brazil and the BRIC countries, the strong power, the economic powerhouses of the future. What new institutional models can they provide? And can you tell us a little bit about your school and how many students, how will it work?
Sure. With ISDI, the idea is to really, really integrate, designers in the industry, and have a cusp of business and design come together, because design is really seen as a competitive advantage in businesses which can really, build and scale up businesses. So that's one idea, and also I think creating real solutions for the needs for a better India. So basically, obviously being a startup and being, in the design industry, we have a lot of challenges which we need to overcome. It's going to be a private-run enterprise, and one of the first biggest challenges is how do we subsidize, design education? How do we make it viable? Because obviously it's a capital-intensive, investment. So how do we really subsidize this to make it viable and to work, so we don't pass on to the burden of the cost on the students? That's one of the questions I'd like to put out there.
How many students?
Well, initially we would look at about 120 students for our first batch.
And you're trying to make it socially accessible, you're trying to provide scholarships?
We want to make it affordable with a lot of scholarships as well. So, we have a lot of people in India you need to educate, so...
Yeah. For girls too would be very interesting, special fees, because in India many times girls don't think of the profession, so it should be very important, as we will do in Gurgaon, special fees for girls.
Two things that I think are quite important. One is trying to get endowments for scholarships is a big thing. But the second is the area of research. A growing area in the UK, maybe in Italy as well, I don't know, is that the research councils are beginning to understand design research. And that doesn't mean the abstract sort of design systems research, but research through design in the practical design studios. And that's big money. Getting into the science research councils, the technology research councils, the humanities research councils, to actually bring, like a mainstream university, I mean, most universities earn 40% of their income from research. But art schools have been terrible at this in the past. You know, they're really in the foothills. I think that's a big story. You develop research wings, and then Parsons is great with the social, you know, the social studies unit in Parsons. You get some really interesting research projects going.
So museums are becoming educational institutions, is that what you're saying?
Yes. No, this is art schools. This is in the research thing. Now, museums are also eligible for research council funding in the UK, particularly if they go into partnership with academic institutions. And you know, I set up a joint course with the V&A on the history of design, a joint course with the V&A conservation, a joint course on curating contemporary art with the Tate, and Deyan had a course with Brighton University on curating contemporary design.
Kingston.
Sorry?
Kingston.
Kingston. What did I say? Brighton. Sorry. Oh, yes, it was that slide. You're right. Okay. But, you know, the joint with museums is another way of sharing costs.
So museums are partnering with universities.
Yeah,
is this a new hybrid Is this a new hybrid institution, or is it just, you know?
Well, it's not new. It's not new. In the UK, as Deyan said about the V&A, all UK art schools started in partnership with museums. When the V&A was founded, it was called the Government School of Design at one end, and at the other end, the Museum of Manufactures. You went in one entrance and it was contemporary practice, and you went in the other entrance, it was the heritage. And they were actually joined at the hip with museums. That was a system that was exported to the United States. Look at Philadelphia, you know, where it's still exactly the same. So in a way, we're going back to where our origins were, which is you have two sort of stereophonic effects between the past and the present. So it isn't new, but it is happening.
It does seem that most of the new developments in education and design aren't coming from the state. They seem to be coming from private initiatives. Justin, you have some knowledge of what's going on in Moscow with Strelka, which is a one-year postgraduate school which looks at architecture, design and planning, funded by enthusiasts who are making it available, I believe, with scholarships, so it's free
the education is free.
Students.
Yeah.
I've just been to see the Samsung Institute of Art and Design in Seoul, which it's fascinating in that the dean told me that they don't award degrees because in South Korea the state is so over-regulatory about degrees and the way that you teach, that they feel that they have more flexibility to not to award degrees, but to teach the way they prefer. Of course, they have the built-in advantage. If you want to become a designer employed by Samsung, you have to spend a bit of time with this institute.
That's the answer.
But I would say that a design museum is an educational institution.
Sure.
Because we wonder, which is the meaning of a design museum in our country, is to make people aware of what is design, to show them what is design, even to think of the client of the future, you know, of the children, you know. So we have lots of different lines. For example, in Italy it's very important to keep back people to use the hands, you know, because everyone was looking for a university degree. So we need to improve our art and craft systems and to make people through exhibition to give new value to work with hands. So we have different strategic lines in our museum, and all exhibitions are following one of these educational, in a wide sense, ideas.
I mean, since we're talking about new models and hybrid models, I was intrigued by your mention earlier of the relationship of design brands in Milan to education and in sponsorship, and you said that that doesn't exist anymore. And I'm wondering whether it's possible to bring back that relation, a very specific relationship between brands and a city, a specific city. Is it possible to, either in Mumbai or in Milan, to kind of re-energize that as a means of funding education, as a means of funding museums without going too far overboard?
I think maybe not, one could say, with a company, but with a group of companies. Before we had Alta Gamma, you know, they are the best brands. I think it's much easier to work with a community of brands, much more than a brand. For example, we had very nice exhibition with Alta Gamma or with a magazine. It was Capital. After 20 years, they had to make a very big exhibition about the idea of what is nowadays luxury, and they involved all the companies which work with them, you know. We work with professional orders, you know, with ISDI, it's the old, or with the Golden Compass, you know, even to wonder what is which is the only prize where people haven't to pay to be part of this Golden Compass selection, you know. To work with them, I think it's a very easy, much easier way to deal with the private sector.
Right. But in the end, museums are doing something else. They're not education institutions as such. They are communicating to an audience. I think the idea of what a museum has changed a lot since Victoria and Albert's time. There is a kind of tension, I think, between the curatorial approach to collect, which is basically to hoard objects and to safeguard them and look after them, and actually feel slightly annoyed about the interest of an audience. What are the public doing in this museum? You know, and the other view, which is now, I think, becoming more and more prevalent, is that the museum is there to engage with an audience, to tell a story about what it has, to provide a place to communicate this kind of message. And of course, the more you say that you're doing something to promote the message of design as being somehow improving, the more you repel that audience. People don't want to be improved, they want to be engaged and entertained. I for many years, was a journalist, and it's fascinating to move from print, magazines and newspapers into the world of the museum, which I do think has a real future in the way that print perhaps doesn't have a long-term future, in that it is still something that you do as a social activity. You engage with others. When you write something in a newspaper, it's like putting a message in a bottle. You might possibly get the occasional writ, people not liking what you said, but really there's very little to and fro in the communication sense. A museum's not like that. You see your audience, you see them enjoying it, or not enjoying it, but at least you see them and you see a social process. And that's the key thing. It's not an institution, it's a way to communicate.
I would really like it if we could, in the final few minutes, involve the audience and take a few thoughts or questions.
My question is, how relevant is it to study outside India and then we talk of Indian heritage, Indian culture, and then to use it? I mean, you know, foreign education, how relevant it is in Indian context, applying it in the Indian context.
Okay. Who'd like to take that?
I always get very upset when people come from either developing countries or countries which have big design challenges and come to the Royal College and stay in London. I always feel much better when, having done their course and learned a lot about designing as a verb, they go back home in order to apply what they've learned to their own cultural situation. Because I don't think that, you know, you can only learn in India how to be a designer in India. I really don't think that. I think you can learn design in lots of different places. It might be, you know, even be in Italy. You know, you can learn design anywhere, and if it's well taught, and if the institution is well run, and it's exciting and invigorating, and so on, and then you bring it all back home. As I say, I mean, an awful lot of graduates actually stay in London, start creating worlds around themselves, and become small-scale businesses on design. And I mean, that's great, but it upsets me because, in a way, I feel an obligation to encourage people to go back and spread the word.
Moreover, you learn a methodology, and you can apply the methodology to your country. You don't learn recipes, you know a method, how to work.
Designing.
And of course, maybe you apply it to a different industrial sector in the country where you are, but the system, the way of working, the way of thinking, of posing questions is something you can easily use back in your country.
No, I just wanted to kind of take off from this idea of building bridges between design and business, and kind of ask what the role is kind of to build bridges between design and city planning, especially in India. A lot of people have spoken about Corbusier, most famous for kind of designing Chandigarh. But, you know, that was designed based on kind of big interventionist strategies and extensively critiqued. by the Jane Jacobs School, who said that it doesn't reflect the kind of lived experiences of residents in the city. Another way of framing this is to ask what the role of the designer and design institutions is to engage with the politics of the city. We see, especially in India, Indian cities, we have this kind of very schizophrenic city. We have, these big bridges being built. We have Navi Mumbai, the Sea Link, for example. So I guess the question is, what is the role of the designer to not just side with the state to kind of build these big visions of what city should be, but also resistance to those visions? And how do we build design institutions, or what is the role of design institutions to think through how these cities are being actively resisted?
A minute to answer that.
I think that's an encyclopedia in itself to answer that, but I would say that cities are not made by professionals working in isolation, by politicians working in isolation, by engineers in isolation, or banks in isolation. These are all people who tend not to see the world in the same way, not to get on with each other, but cities only work if they're all in the same room together.
I was mentioning the role of design councils at the beginning. One of the roles was helping governments and politicians to learn how to commission.
Thank you very much.